The Norwegian Method.
I'm Olav Alexander Boo, peak human performance developer, coach to Christian Blumenfeld and Gustav Eden.
I'm Dr. David Lippman, a health and human performance specialist, and welcome to the Norwegian Method podcast.
The Norwegian Method.
This podcast is sponsored by VO2 Master, the ultimate portable metabolic analyzer. Head to the show notes to learn how to get your first assessment kit free. Thank you, Olav, for joining us. I'm excited to be part of this Norwegian Method podcast and really give people something they can look at, help their training going forward. And the goal here is the age group athlete looking to qualify for Kona or perform at Kona. And of course, there'll be learnings for everybody here. And having spoken to you before, professionals will take something from this, amateurs will take something from this. But that's the rough target here for context. And I think in that light, we should go through some of the fundamentals of coaching and how your system works, because I think sometimes people can misunderstand that, particularly around, many coaches will have a weekly structure. They'll do this on a Tuesday and this on a Thursday and then on a Saturday, whereas we're going to look at how your system works, so to speak, or what's your performance model that will then impact how the rest of the podcast series is listened to. So this is really about setting the scene for people so they can really understand things, dip in and out of this, refer back to this podcast if they need to, and we can go from there. So I think the first thing to understand for you, and it's something that I really enjoy, and it's a way I approach things myself, is you don't have a system that fits, and then when we stack on top of it, you go the other way, which is let's start with the end in mind and reverse engineer back from that. And I think if that's the case, let's talk about how that performance model then fits into that, right? So what is the end goal in the performance model?
So the end goal in the performance model is, of course, to understand what are the demands and how do you optimize for that, given your constraints, whether you're an elite or whether you're an age grouper. So we could say that the performance model is, of course, understanding what is it that you're really optimizing for. Mm-hmm. And the next step is then, obviously, when you do understand what you're optimizing for, you are trying to reverse engineer that from, okay, this is where I have to be, this is where I am, and how do I quantify that, or how do I measure that so I understand the gap? And the third and last thing then is basically, when you have done that, so how to get there. And that's where the budget comes in, where you need to have a budget. So you distribute your hours around so that you optimize exactly to bridge that gap between where you are and where you want to be at race day.
Yeah. So that's a gap analysis for those unfamiliar. So It's as simple as, where do I want to be and where am I and how do I bridge that gap? And I think this is so key, is the output, which is velocity. Now, I think it's really important in the context of the body that people understand it's a complex system, and this uses systems theory. So a simple system is basically single cause, direct line, single outcome. So a light switch is a classic example. You then have a complicated system with perhaps more than one input and perhaps more than one output, but they sort of work together. So it might be two light switches with one light bulb, two switches, to use the analogy. And then there's the complicated system. So the complex system. That was a complicated system. This is a complex system. And the complex system is we do something at one end, a whole bunch of stuff happens that we don't understand necessarily, or we do. And then there's an output. And you can do something, or something can change on the front end, and it may have an impact in the middle, but we may not see an output here. And that's, I think, the way that the body needs to be understood, because that's the way the body works. And I think that's the beauty in the system you have, which is you can only measure certain things, right? You can't measure everything in that, but it doesn't necessarily matter, because the ultimate output is very clear, which is velocity. And then you have some touch points along in the middle of the system there. So I guess we have the output, it's velocity, that's the goal. So now, I guess, what are the steps back from that?
So I think in our model, the steps back there is, of course, output is velocity, as you stated, and then let's say the next performance metric that sits before that, and I distinguish between what I call submetrics and performance metrics. Performance metrics are what can be quantified as an output. But it can also be understood as an input to something as well. So difference is that, for example, like if we look at velocity, you can achieve a velocity, which is obviously the target, but you can achieve that in many ways. You can, if you just look at, for example, in running, you can have a specific velocity with different stride lengths and stride rates. If you're just looking at something like an increased stride length, it doesn't mean necessarily that your performance is better, even if you have, unless it also affects velocity or the output of it. So in the end, velocity is what really matters. So then, but on the performance metric side, then we have three. I normally distinguish this in three boxes or acute boxes on race day, and that is basically velocity that sits on the output, and this is the goal or the ultimate measure of performance. And then you have the step before, which is mechanical power. So basically, how much mechanical power do you have to input in order to get that velocity sustainably? And then ultimately, of course, there is an input to this, because we know fuel or oxygen is super important in order to be able to sustain a certain power output. And that's where the metabolic power comes into the equation. So basically, the performance model is comprised by velocity, mechanical power, and metabolic power. Much in the same way like a car, you can imagine that, okay, so how fast you go around the track is the velocity or the speed or the output of the car. That's what's going to bring you to the medal in the end. And then, of course, you need a certain engine in order to do that. So how big is the engine, or how much power do you need in order to be able to go around on the track on race day? But then, of course, if you just optimize for an engine and you forget that you have a fuel tank, that engine can't run without any fuel, then you're back to square one. So you also need to look at how much fuel do you need to feed that engine with per time in order to get a certain power output, to get a certain velocity. And velocity is what matters in the end.
Yeah. And so to give a level of depth more on this model, between velocity and mechanical power, so we're talking the middle and the end, there is mechanical efficiency. Now this should make a lot of sense for people, particularly cyclists, because it's where drag sits, it's where a clean chain sits, it's all these things, right? So what is the velocity that my certain mechanical power is creating? So it's aero positions, it's wetsuit, it's speed suits, it's all that stuff, right? It's bottles down your chest, it's all of it. Now step back from mechanical power. Between mechanical power and metabolic power, we have metabolic efficiency. Now, this could be things like absorption of food. It could be all that stuff. So it's how much are we absorbing and going from there. Now, I think the next helpful step for people will be to think about what they know as metrics, things that I talked about in endurance, and slot these into the model, right? So obviously velocity is the simplest. It's a stopwatch, right? We've hopefully measured the course, or we haven't. It doesn't really matter, because it's about how quickly do you get to the end. But it's a stopwatch. So this is time trials and this is critical velocity. That's where that sits.
Distance and time.
Yep. And then in the mechanical power zone, we have what people often measure and talk about. So FTP, or critical power for running or even cycling, critical pace. And then a step back from that, the metabolic power is where we have the stuff that everybody really likes to brag about. So thresholds and VO2 max. So I think the elegant thing here to remember is Goodhart's law, which is when the measure becomes a goal, it ceases to be a good measure. So the goal isn't the highest VO2 max, so we wouldn't race. The goal is the fastest race. Can I win? Do I get to the start, from the start line to the finish line, the fastest? And that has any number of components, including tactical, technical, as well as then all these other things we talked about.
Yeah, exactly. You mentioned threshold, and I think that is actually one thing that is important to cover here. But because for me, basically, threshold is not really a measure of metabolic power or input. That's more a variable that we are trying to control in order to optimize, let's say, the translation from metabolic power to mechanical power. And by that I mean that the race, when you reverse engineer from what is needed in order to do this race, then you know that, this is the time I have to do to cover this distance.
Yep.
And then that's based on factors like aerodynamics, rolling resistance, mechanical transmission losses, and these kind of things. Then you get your what kind of mechanical power do I need to produce in order to produce that velocity or output. And then you can say, you can always optimize aerodynamics, you can always optimize rolling friction, you can always optimize your transmission losses and these kind of things. But that's something you're going to do in parallel. It doesn't replace training. So here in this context, we are now specifically looking at training. What are you doing in training, and how do you optimize your training as well for the same thing? So then there is a certain mechanical power in order to sustain that velocity. And then in order to sustain that mechanical power, if that's a short duration, then typically let's say what most people actually don't realize is that then if you're looking like very short duration, like for track cyclists, you actually don't want to have a very high threshold. as a function of your VO2 max. So if you're two athletes with the same VO2 max, an athlete that has a low threshold would typically be an athlete that are optimized for the track, while an athlete that typically is optimized for, let's say, Tour de France or an Ironman or these kind of things, then you typically want to have a high threshold. And the simple reason is that for a track cyclist, they need to get as much power as quickly as possible by having a very powerful glycolytic system and a very powerful oxidative system. Or aerobic system and anaerobic system. And for a long course athlete or a Tour de France cyclist, you can't have this. Even the sprinters in Tour de France, you are an extreme endurance athlete. You are cycling 160 kilometers on average before, or close to 160 kilometers on average before you're actually putting in the sprint. So if you're now using too much fuel, getting to that close to that finish line before you put in your sprint, you are exhausted or empty your fuel tanks, no matter how much carbs you are trying to put into your body or ketones or whatever you're eating. But the thing is that threshold is more like a component that we're just adjusting. So again, metabolic power is really VO2, or let's say indirectly measured as VO2. Mm-hmm. Directly you would go to thermodynamics. Yep. And then you have the mechanical power, where basically is the, let's say, where you have converted that or let's say you have converted those calories into mechanical joules that basically moves the bike or you or forward and results in a certain velocity.
Yep, perfect. And then I guess what you're talking about there is actually something that is well researched and well known, which is zonal compression, right? So we're compressing zones now if we need to, if we're long term, and that's as a result of improved fractional utilization usually, right? And a thing to remember here is the body often trades off. And so, for instance, in the Breaking 2 project, they measured a bunch of people, a bunch of runners, and they had what was their threshold and what was their VO2 max, and they did efficiency. And what you saw was a huge difference between efficiency and VO2 max. And we've talked a lot today off air about the trade-offs the body makes. And I think it's really important to have context here is that you'll have that. So you talked about an example, and you've given this before on podcasts, of the difference between moving Christian and Gustav from the Olympics through to Kona, for instance, and trying to change those things. And you have a drop in VO2 max, whereas an improved efficiency, because that's what's required.
Exactly. And again, if I were just looking to try to improve efficiency and I was trying to quantify efficiency as something, then the question is what are we trying to optimize here? And then is it very easy to get lost? Is it like, do we want an optimized heart? Are there more conversion of muscle fibers and all this kind of thing? And then how do we quantify this? The problem is that it's so easy to get lost in so many sub-metrics or components or small details that we know, of course, through research, that there's a good correlation between them and a certain, let's say, characteristic. But in the end, what we are really trying to do is to affect the the required mechanical power output, or most importantly, the velocity in the end. And this can be then be best quantified as, let's say that we know that, of course, the oxidative capabilities of type 1 fibers are higher than they are for type 2 fibers, but we know that also the contractile velocity of type 2 fibers are higher than it is for type 1 fibers, but they fatigue much faster. So then how do we know what is the right balance here and all this kind of thing? Well, the problem is that you can't know. You can only correlate. The best way to measure this, if you're from a performance perspective, is just to look at, okay, you're trying to do something with efficiency. Okay, so when you do that, and that you hope that theory or hypothesis is correct, then it means basically that you are hoping that your mechanical power for that duration goes up, all other things unchanged.
And you don't care about those other things. That's the key here. Is it doesn't matter what's changing. It doesn't matter that whether your type 1 or type 2 fibers have changed, or whether you've got more mitochondria. You don't need to measure those things, because you have a really strong anchor, which has the cost of that power changed. It's really simple. Yeah. Has that metabolic cost of that power changed? Yeah. Or not?
Yeah. I would say that we do of course care what is happening to the fibers, or mitochondrial density, or enzyme in your body, or other things that might happen there, your stroke volume, but it is more of a way to try to understand what are we when we see performance increases or decreases, why does it there, so that we can get more precise in our prescription in the future, and also describing the problem. But I would say that the problem is that there is only a correlation, because you don't know whether that was the whole and full answer to, let's say, the adaptation that went on in your body in order to produce that change there. So that's why I call that submetrics, because they are interesting to understand in order to let's say, to be able to be more precise and in what we do, and understand why sometimes it works and other times it doesn't work. But in the end, what you're really trying to influence is on the input side. You're trying to do something with, let's say, your metabolic power. On the, let's say, on the efficiency side, you are trying to then optimize your mechanical power, and on the output side, which is the ultimate measurement, is that you want to be able to race faster. That it is really those things that matters. Like, even, for example, we very often think that, okay, high stroke volume is important. So when is a high stroke volume? Just to give an example of this.
The stroke volume being the amount of blood that is ejected from the heart from one contraction.
Yes, exactly. So then when is a high stroke volume important? We could maybe say that everybody wants a high stroke volume. Or cardiac output, really, because again, cardiac output is the most important of when you look at that equation. But even cardiac output is a submetric of VO2 max. And
cardiac output is the combination of the stroke volume and the heart rate.
Yeah.
So
mainly.
Yeah, and so as a result, that trades off as well, right? So we talked about trade-offs before. So people with a bigger, more athletic heart generally have a slower heart rate. So we see this, right, for the same cardiac output, and vice versa.
Yeah, and why? Because basically it is oxygen, how much oxygen you need per minute, that really is the driver for this. If you can't think yourself to a big heart or a high VO2 max. You actually have to do the work, and then the body will try to adapt. When you do the training, the body will try to adapt towards that, and it will always try to solve it in the easiest, or let's say in the simplest way, or call it in the way that costs the least possible calories over time to achieve that.
Today's episode is sponsored by Maurten, the leader in fueling for endurance sports. With patented hydrogel technology, Maurten found a way for athletes like Christian and Gustav to tolerate more carbohydrate during training and racing. The advances in performance when using the Maurten gels, drink mixes, and bicarb system have been clear. It's the fuel behind triathlon gold medals, world championships, and world records. Hydrogel technology has no added flavour, preservatives, or colours, and is made with only natural ingredients, so it's clean. Only what's required to aid performance, nothing more. And now you can benefit from the same world-class fueling system thanks to an exclusive one-time code that will give our listeners 20% off the Maurten 1/52 collection, a curated selection of products to fuel a 1 week of structured training. Especially in training, every fueling moment counts. It's how athletes adapt and race better. Simply add the 1/52 collection to your basket at maurten.com and enter the code in our show notes at the checkout. I think there's a couple of things we should note here. So there's not infinite resources.
No.
Right? So
very important to understand.
Yeah. Well, I mean, in many ways, both adaptive resources, so the body just can't adapt to everything.
Yeah.
There's also not infinite resources in a week. We're talking to age groupers here. They generally have jobs or something like that. So there's those budgets as well to consider. So you famously talk about calorie budget, but there's also time budgets and all these other budgets. So that's why you can't optimize for a VO2 max and efficiency in that. And then there's the trade-off in the body that we've already touched on. But there's lots of reasons you can't. So that's a really important point to underscore. But the next thing to underscore, to think about, and it pertains to perhaps threshold, definitely pertains to VO2 max, these sort of things, is capacity or indeed durability. So yes, it's fine to have this ability to output watts, but how long can you sustain that for? And that's a really important point here for people. And it's another variable in this, particularly in longer course stuff, because it's really, really important. It doesn't matter what your VO2 max is if you can't sustain it for very long, which is exactly the point you just made.
Yes. Very often when we do measure like FTP or we measure VO2 max and so on, is that those are reported very often as one-dimensional metrics. What I mean by that is that you can have two athletes that has 80 milliliter per minute per kilogram as their VO2 max, but one can sustain that for a couple of minutes, or let's say 2 minutes, another one can sustain that for 4 minutes. And that is an astronomical difference in performance. And the same also with FTP. Of course, a lot of people, they do like a 20-minute test. And so when you do a 20-minute all-out test, that is exactly what you're doing. You're doing 20 minutes all-out. And that, of course, if you then report that power as a 20-minute power, then you actually have gotten one part of a two-dimensional metric, which is more useful in many cases because you know how much power you can sustain for 20 minutes. the disadvantage is if we start to try to extrapolate it into something else, like for example, like a lot of people have done and still do, is that they multiply that by, let's say, by 0.95 to find their, let's say, then their FDP.
Yeah, the 60-minute.
Yeah,
because for most people, they sit on a bell curve, which
Yeah.
is roughly in the middle, and okay, 95% fits for most people. And look, to be honest, 20 to 60 minutes isn't a huge difference from that perspective. I think if you tried to extrapolate that out to, say, 2-hour FTP or equivalent, what's sustainable for 2 hours, that error gets significantly bigger and it becomes much less accurate of a model.
The problem also is that even extrapolating that to 60 minutes is already there. We know there are huge differences. So you can have like a variation of 10% when you extrapolate it out there. And then you can't, on race day, going 10% too hard or 10% too low is already gonna either set you up for failure, or it's gonna set you up like far down on the list when you're passing over the finish line. I think that like doing a 20-minute test is very useful, but ideally you should combine them also with something more. And that means that, for example, even when you do metabolic power testing, so measuring your VO2 max, I would say that VO2 max in itself is not that interesting. More interesting is that let's say that you are doing an all-out test. So let's say you do a running test. So you do like something that like maybe takes you a couple of minutes to exhaustion. Let's say we just use like 2 or 3 durations. And why is this important? If you do like 20-minute all-out and you are able to do that at 300 watts, okay, good. But you can also have that for another athlete, but that athlete beats you in many competitions. Because let's say that competition has a duration of 10 minutes or it has a duration of 60 minutes. Why? Well, you can achieve 300 watts for 20 minutes in many different ways. So to give one simple example, let's say that you have now an athlete that are more optimized for, he does more time trial work than you. So he doesn't have the same anaerobic power, let's say short duration power output that you have. But basically what he has lowered the short duration power to achieve, but he is basically tangenting you at the 20-minute power. But then basically when you go out to the 60-minute power, he is able to stay with a higher power output there than what you do for the same training volume. It's just that he's spending more time on optimizing the 60-minute power than what you do. The other way to do the exact same thing is that you can have an athlete that maybe is like a track cyclist, or let's say somebody that has more shorter duration power than what you do. But what they do is that because they're putting in them higher volume, and they are spending just enough time to get the same 20-minute power as you do, but they also spend more time on, for example, increasing the short duration power as well. They might beat you both on the 20-minute power and they might and beat you on the short duration power because they're spending more time on exercising and they arrive at the same 20-minute power. And this is not only applicable to power, this is applicable to metabolic power, because you can also look at how much oxygen am I able to consume over 5 minutes before I basically exhaust. And then you can do the same for 10 minutes, and you can do the same for, let's say, 30 minutes, and then you start to look at also what's happening with the metabolic system as well as a function of that. And then, of course, one step further, closer to the ultimate performance metric, that you do the same for power. So you do, for example, because why do we want to know this? Let's say you want to optimize your 60-minute power or your 4-hour power, for example. Then, like you mentioned, there's a budget to this. There's only a finite amount of calories or hours that you can put into your training, whether you're an elite or whether you're an age grouper, because you have constraints in your life. Purely either because you're not able to eat more, sleep more. And on the other side, you have work, you have family, you have other things that you also have to spend time on. And that means that we want to optimize the hours that you actually are putting into this. So then back to, okay, you have to understand what is the demand of the race. And then basically this is what really is demand, so the performance model, and how I actually can achieve that. And then you reverse engineer that. So you're looking at, okay, how can I get there from where I am today? And then, for example, if you look at your power profile, so let's say you do like a 5-minute all out, a 20-minute all out, or maybe you do a 5 and you do a 10 and you a 20-minute all out. Now, if you see that you compare to, let's say, your neighbor or your competitor, that you have typically, you see that yes, you're arriving more or less at the same 20-minute power, but you're looking to optimize your 4-hour power. a very strong indicator of that you can actually now optimize, spend a little bit more of those hours available. So let's say you've got 5 hours available, and try to optimize a little bit more towards the long duration. If that you see that you compared to your neighbor, you have a much higher 5-minute power than your neighbor have, but you have the same 20-minute power, because it means basically that most likely you have a stronger, let's say short, or it doesn't just indicate, it actually it is evidence of that you have a stronger short duration power output than your neighbor have. And if you see that I never need that, that's not why I actually am winning races, or that's why I'm not losing races. It's not because I'm not able to stay in a breakaway. That's rather the opposite. I'm actually always able to bridge any gap that is there, to stay on somebody's wheel. But the closer I get to the finish line, this is when I start to fatigue. Well, bleed off a little bit of that 5-minute power, trade away a little bit of that, give away a little bit of that, and then started to actually spend it on maybe a little bit on optimizing your longer rides, because you don't need it. Or opposite. You always see that in a race, yes, you have the same FTP, or let's say 20-minute power as your neighbor have. But when you get closer to the finish line, he always has a little extra kick that they put in that you are not able to respond to. Okay, maybe you need to optimize your 5-minute power just a little bit, up it a little bit. And this is why like having a multi-point curve where you can look at what are the relationship or the ratios between short and longer duration power outputs is super important, because that gives you an idea not only of where are you today, but a little bit also where you should prioritize your budget. Where do you actually spend your hours now on the next weeks, months leading into the race to be able to put out a higher velocity in the end, like to win or optimize your results?
Velocity for the given duration required. Right?
Exactly.
Across 3 disciplines that impact each other.
Yes.
So the swim is going to impact the bike, is going to impact the run. So how do I optimize in this context for end goal, let's call it Ironman, to have the best velocity across my swim and my bike and my run? And they all 3 impact each other, and we have to make choices, right? We have to trade off here. And so that's what we're trying to help people do, is how do I make the trade-offs? How do I do a gap analysis? And how do I get there?
A nice metaphor or analogy is actually like in a business, for example, when you're trying to optimize your business. So for many of the age groupers sitting out there listening to this, we can they are probably working in business. Maybe several of them are entrepreneurs, business owners, and so on. And then what you can imagine here, you're running a business, and what you're looking to do is to exactly get more cash in, because that's also a measure of that people really appreciate your products.
Yep.
So how do you do this? How are you able, and not only actually appreciate, but they're also actually aware of your product. You can have like a very fantastic product, but people not aware of it. So how do you balance now your budget, the money that you actually got in your account, in a way that actually produces the best output, and that means cash in. That means that maybe you need, if your product is really lousy, you need to maybe prioritize a little bit more, let's say, off your budget towards optimizing that. Or if you have like a fantastic product, but not many people are aware of it, it doesn't make sense to really optimize your product very much more. You have to prioritize more of your budget towards marketing or get awareness around your product. And that's the same thing with training also, like whether you do high intensity, medium intensity, or low intensity training is very much a function. What do you need?
We are brought to you today by Plasmade. Plasmade is a proprietary liquid performance and recovery supplement formulated using only one active ingredient, French maritime pine bark extract, aka PBE. PBE is an adaptogen which triggers your body to produce a stabilized form of nitric oxide, which is a powerful vasodilator, improving blood flow to muscles and the brain. Plasmade is for use pre and post exercise, augmenting other energy and hydration supplementation used. In addition to all of this, Plasmade also has powerful anti-inflammatory and antioxidant effects, which aid in recovery from training and competition. For your 25% discount on Plasmade and to learn more, head to the show notes. Alrighty, so we talked a bit about a few things, and we talked about the performance model, and I think it's really important here to think about some things where people might get over interested. So we talked a bit about VO2 max already. A good example here, I think, is red blood cell mass. And so talking about red blood cell mass and where this fits into the system will be really helpful. And I think within that, let's then talk about or contrast that with a supplement. So it doesn't matter the supplement, but let's think about some supplement that affects something somewhere. Let's call it inflammation. So let's say antioxidants, for instance, and how that might impact things. So we've talked about the system and where it sits, right? Which is, we have velocity, we've got mechanical power, and back to metabolic power. And so where would red blood cell mass sit there? And I guess in that, let's talk about like how over indexing on that necessarily, in a complex system that we talked about doesn't necessarily have the effects you might think it does. So the goal of hemoglobin is to carry oxygen in the blood.
Yeah.
The question is that the only rate limiter? And the answer is definitely not, right? Because it scales up to other things. So how much oxygen can we extract at the level of the lungs? How much can we get into the blood? How much can we get onto the hemoglobin? How much can we offload? And how quickly can that all get around, right? Do I need the same amount of hemoglobin? Or do I need more because I want to stay with a low output? Or do I need less because I want to go to a higher output?
Yeah. So I think this is again why it's important for me at least to have this performance model, because when we are trying to do something, we very often say that I'm going to increase the amount of type 1 fibers, or I'm going to increase the amount of type 2 fibers, or I'm going to increase my hemoglobin mass or my cardiac output or stroke volume or whatever. And then it's important to understand, okay, so where is this really what is happening? When or how can you even know that you are influencing this? And how do you know even this is really the limitation of the body? Obviously, we are not engines or living that can just sustain whatever we do without anything coming into the body. So obviously we are like an engine there, or like a car or anything else that does something. In this case, when we talk about hemoglobin mass, where does hemoglobin mass sit on the performance model? So for me, basically, hemoglobin mass sits actually quite far away from the performance, let's say the first layer of the performance model, which is basically velocity, mechanical power, and metabolic power.
Wow. So it sits very far from velocity. So it sits at the other end of it, which is it scales up. So it is, again, below it as a component of the metabolic power.
Yeah.
So it sits 2 steps removed from velocity and then layers deeper than the metabolic power.
But this is unfortunately not as simple, especially at elite level, because the thing is that I like, again, going back to reverse engineering and performance models and these kind of things, I very often like to black box things, because hemoglobin mass sits actually very far down on, let's say, on the submetric scale. So we already said VO2 sits on the top, and then basically a part of the VO2 equation is fraction of expired O2, or let's say the delta O2, how much are you extracting from there. Below there again, that is a function of your cardiac output. So basically how much are you circulating around in your body at the same time. And under there is of course stroke volume and heart rate and ejection fraction. And below, and as a part of that component again, then you have of course plasma, and then you have hemoglobin mass and so on. So you can imagine now that you can achieve the same VO2 by just also pumping more blood per time. Then you're delivering the same amount of, let's say, oxygen carrying hemoglobin around in your body as if you just pumping a little bit slower. So you slow down, let's say, your heart rate, or let's say cardiac output, you slow down your cardiac output. Because again, heart rate and stroke volume and ejection fraction sits as subcomponents again of cardiac output. And cardiac output is a subcomponent again of VO2 max again. So you understand this, we are already moving so far down into the cascade. And the problem is that this, when I talk about cascade, think of it almost like a tree. Yep. VO2 max sits at the top of this side of the equation of the performance model, so on the left side of it. Then basically we can think of VO2 max as a star that sits on the top there. And then basically the further we move down on the tree, the wider the tree becomes, and there are more and more basically branches. And all these branches is basically what causes this tree to be able to balance this star at the top there. So whether you increase your hemoglobin mass, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to have a higher VO2 max. There are many ways to achieve it. And for some athletes, that typically manifests itself most likely as an increase in hemoglobin mass. But for other athletes, there might be other ways to exactly also achieve the same VO2 max, but not necessarily that they are responding equally much to an increase in VO2 max, in hemoglobin mass.
Yeah, I think another analogy that might be helpful to people is thinking about it in the form of rocks. So little rocks, big rocks, etc. So the big rocks are the important things. They are, what we talked about already. So it's metabolic power, it's mechanical power, and it's velocity, right? And they have their own hierarchy, which is velocity is king, and then we go down from there. And as we get lower and lower down, the change has to be bigger to actually impact the metric. And it may not even do that because there might be a trade-off. Again, it's a black box, it's a complex system. So I guess to just put a bow in the supplement discussion, like the supplement would have to make a significant impact at either a high level or an even bigger one at a lower level to then impact whatever, let's call it metabolic power in this case, to then impact and go on from there. So that's kind of the lens in which you view things through. And I think it's really important to understand because it helps you really quickly. Whether or not people use the same model and is irrelevant, having a model and understanding it and really understanding things will help you make decisions, right? So it's why are we doing this? How do I make decisions about this? Like, okay, where does this sit on my model? Because again, you have a time budget as a coach, right?
Exactly.
And an entrepreneur and a father and a husband and all the things, right? So how do you make these decisions quickly? And the answer is, where does it sit? What does it impact? Okay, yeah. And you're really clear on your model, and therefore you're really clear on decision making when you're trying to balance things. Because again, you have to balance things. Even for Christian, even for Gustav, you have to balance time or whatever else. And so it's, where does this fit in the model and how does it scale up to going faster ultimately?
Yeah, I think that actually brings it maybe very, or let's say brings out the point even clearer, because when you measure things as, if you only measure the velocity of an athlete, you can of course make a velocity profile of an athlete. And then you can understand whether this guy has a very high top velocity or whether he is more like there's very little drop off between, or when he's running like for 1 minute all out, the difference between 1 minute all out or let's say 100 meter all out compared to a 400 meter all out compared to a 1200 meter or 1500 meter all out, there are very little difference in that, telling you maybe that, okay, this athlete is typically an endurance athlete. If it's a track athlete, like typically running like 100 meters, they would have like be able to run like fast 100 meter, but if you put them out on a long run like a marathon, they will probably run very slow.
There's a really good clip of, I think it's a bunch of 100 meter, 200 meter runners running at 800 meters. It's Carl Lewis and the likes, and they're running at 800, and it's amazing to watch them just tighten up. And you can just see, and I mean, these events are pretty similar to each other comparative to many other things, right? And these guys tighten up, they're not ready for it. They don't have those capacities, those endurance capacities.
Exactly. And I think this also illustrates the point quite well, because if you only measure velocity, then of course you can optimize the profile of an athlete. You just see that, okay, you are going to run a 10K, but we basically see that you basically are much stronger than your peers on 100 meter and 400 meter. And if that also then bridges into that, basically what you see is that, yeah, you are perfectly capable of keeping up with them until 6-7K, but then after that, then you're really starting to struggle to keep up a little bit more. After that, you're lacking the endurance capabilities. So trade away a little bit of that top end velocity or the training that goes into that, because you have too much of it, and put it into your available budget or time available into optimizing a little bit more on the endurance side of the equation. How much? That's of course a little bit where you have to go and experiment a little bit and go, but don't make like drastic changes. Make small changes, because you are as good as you are, and you're trying to optimize on it. And optimizing is not making astronomical changes. It's not significant changes. It's about making smaller and controlled changes, so you learn from basically how you respond to it, and that also requires some patience.
This is, I think, a really good point to bring this up, and it's something I've been thinking about a lot, which is how at times it can be mischaracterized what you are doing as a coach and as a group, which is, oh yeah, they're measuring lactate and they're doing all these sensors, and all of that is with the view towards smallest possible change, measuring it, understanding it in the context of the performance model. So it's, are we going faster? Sure. We do actually care a little bit about why, because we need to understand what's moving so that we can understand how to optimize later if we want to change back to a short distance or come back to long distance or both, or move within a season. How do we do that? So you're really characterizing this. And so what you're really doing is regular testing, so you understand the profile of the athlete, because again, single point in time doesn't help. Telling you my 10K time from 2 years ago doesn't help you understand me today. Showing you my training over the last couple of weeks, you can go, okay, velocity, you can go heart rate, you can go, okay, yeah, this looks all right, and here's RPE, and now we add in other sensors. Of course, now we all of a sudden starting to see a picture of me, and you go, okay, you look deficient in X, let's work on that. And what that would look like is changing one training session or maybe 2 training sessions a week, just a little bit, and then we test. And we keep, and by testing, I mean actually just look at all the sensors, because that's why you're using them all, is let's actually use all these sensors so we don't have to do a test. Because the worst thing you could possibly do is a 10K time trial every couple of weeks to make sure your training's going well, because then you spend half your life tapering and half your life recovering from the 10K time trial, and you're not actually training.
You could, of course, just do a 10K in training, and then it's more a function of fatigue as well, and you just look at what's happening there. But I completely agree. The benefit of doing or having a lot of sensors is that they are acting as accountants. You don't wait for looking at the end of the year when you make up your accounts and you look at, okay, how much money did I actually earn and how much did I spend? You're actually learning as you go by doing different kinds of analysis of the cash flow. And this way you can also start optimizing on the cash flow way before you go bankrupt, or actually learn from why do I earn a lot of money one part of the year, another part of the year not, by understanding the different mechanisms that are below there. And I think we really care about the why, but again, also I actually have my own, I use the performance model on myself also as a coach. Where do I actually, how can I influence the training of Christian and Gustav, for example, in the most positive way? Where do I have to put my hours in order to do that? And of course, there are many things that influences that, but it's not necessarily directly measured in velocity, power, and or mechanical power and metabolic power. But I'm always asking myself also, if I spend time on this, will this affect Christian and Gustav's performance short term or long term? And sometimes, of course, I have to prioritize long term. I cannot only just prioritize short term always. I have to also look at long term. But if I basically say this is something that is nice, sure. If I need that nice to be able to keep motivated, then of course it's nice, but that sits down in a little bit, let's say, down the hierarchy, or in let's say into the submetrics. But I try to black box things, or let's say that there are so many things. If I'm gonna wonder about life, and which I often do, but if I'm gonna wonder about why do I work this way, and I spend all my time on looking at something that really doesn't affect the performance of Christian and Gustav, for example, long term or short term, then I can't justify spending time on it. Much the same way that, yes, there are many training sessions that maybe we would like to do because we really love doing them. And of course, if they are important to our motivation, yeah, well, okay, keep them now and then to keep you motivated. But you also have to do the things that you maybe that don't like yet, but you maybe gonna learn to like because you excel in it and you actually get motivated because you see that you actually are getting better at something else as well. So I think back to the performance model is of course that looking at a velocity purely and then looking at the velocity profile gives you, of course, that's an extremely powerful tool already just there. You can create gold medalists purely from that. The benefit of also doing a power model as well, so you're basically doing a power profiling of an athlete and also metabolic profiling of an athlete, is that you can start exactly more now to be more detailed in your priorities of where do you want to optimize the athlete, or where do you need to prioritize your time to understand how to optimize your athlete. Because if you only do a velocity profile of an athlete, then you can start to, let's say, rebalance your budgets a little bit less on the high intensity, a little bit more on long intensity stuff, or vice versa, or medium duration, depending on, of course, what is the target that you are trying to achieve. Then at the moment you start to do also a power profile, you can also start now to look at efficiency. If you see that this guy has his velocity is okay, but you see he has a massive power output, and then you say, okay, what on earth is going on here? This is basically where maybe you see, he has really bad aerodynamics. By just optimizing the aerodynamics for this guy here, he's going to start to win races. So already there you added a layer of information that you previously didn't have, and now you suddenly have it, and it means that you can get much more targeted in where you're putting in your time to optimize your athlete, or in your training for your athlete. And that allows us, of course, to be more precise. So, of course, understanding then the submetrics as well. So going into hemoglobin mass, and we do all these measurements because we want to understand why. But the problem is that the further you move away from the performance model, or let's say the performance metrics, is that it becomes inherently more complicated, and to the extent where it becomes so complex that you lose complete oversight. Even research doesn't have full oversight over how humanity really, or humans really, work. We are still trying to decompile that. And that's when it's good to have this model to always go back to, so that if you don't really understand or you're uncertain, okay, so how does it influence the model? And if it doesn't influence the model, maybe it's the wrong place to really spend your energy. If it influences the model, in what direction does it influence the model? And this allows you exactly to advance your understanding of where to put your priorities and so on. There is unfortunately no answer to what is better or worse, and it is unfortunately even more complex than we have now talked about the body. We haven't talked about psychology. We touched on it briefly. That
we're getting there.
Yeah, briefly, by exactly saying that maybe you need to keep that one session that motivates you, even though it might not necessarily make you physiologically faster, but because it helps your psychology and it helps you train, and putting in the hours in training there, probably long term that's going to be better for you, at least medium term.
Yeah, and I think so. I want to just really highlight a couple of things for people is the coach spending time. Like there are going to be coaches listening to this, and I think it's really important you understanding that you're not, let's use the hemoglobin mass thing again. You're not wasting a bunch of time on that because it sits so far from velocity, right? Yes, you'll spend a bit of time, but not a great deal of time, and you need to budget that as a coach, right? And you also need to budget your emotional health and your psychological health yourself as a coach, right? So again, treating yourself as a performance athlete in the performance model or a performance person in that model is you can't burn yourself out looking at all the research on hemoglobin mass because it doesn't really affect things as much as you'd like it to. So understanding a model like that and having a hierarchy and a really clear understanding of the priorities. And some people will call it coaching philosophy, some people call it other things. Whatever it is, you need to have a really clear understanding of your North Star metric to then improve that. And then you scale into that as part of the team, right? Because there is a team here. There is the two, Christian and Gustav impacting each other. There's yourself. There's all sorts of other people around you. So how does that fit together? And you've engineered an environment here around that. And I think that's something that is probably not talked about as much as it could be, is around motivation and psychology. And I think that's something we should go into a little bit now, not too deep, because we could spend the next 7 hours and a whole podcast series on motivation and psychology. But I guess, how does that play into the day-to-day for you? There's components that we'll talk about in racing, right? And we're going to have an episode on racing. And one of those questions in there is going to be, what happens when the guys want to race 7 races or 3 races in a weekend? And how do you, where does that sit in the hierarchy and how does that fit in? But I guess maybe just a high level on psychology, motivation, and emotional health of the guys as well. Gustav's recently suffered an injury. How does that impact things? Because it's probably the biggest initial setback or most significant setback in some regards these guys have had. So how does that affect the team and you and all of it?
Yeah, so first of all, I think that like the injury that Gustav sustained, of course, it impacts him just enough that he is struggling to be on the podium. But we have to remember that still the performance of somebody that comes top 30 or top 40, even in the World Triathlon Series levels, are still some of the fittest people in the world.
Yeah, well, the top 30 the top 30 football player in the world plays in one of the best teams and is earning a lot of money.
Exactly. So, but the thing is here that things are very sensitive, and this, of course, this year Gustav got it all. And of course, that's he goes through a period now, which I would say that actually is good. You can maybe say, of course, ideally you would not like to experience it, but of course he gets to experience it, and that from that he learns quite a lot that a lot of people will probably not learn now. They will probably learn much later in life. Now he is strong and he can really develop methods and tools to cope with new things. These guys are really robust, so they know, of course, what's going on, and they know the reason for it. But again, it's not nice. There's a pressure around you, and these kind of things that you also have to deal with. So it's better to be on the starting line and be maybe second best physiologically prepared, but psychologically you are where you need to be, and you are ready to beat your competitors down down into the ground. Because if you are the best physiologically prepared, but you don't have the psychological motivation to really take that out completely, you're not going to win. You're not going to even reach the podium.
And so how do you work on that psychology? Like, are you intentionally, there's stories of, Michael Phelps' coach breaking goggles. There's all sorts of stuff like this of like trying to create this different psychology, right? And we talked a little bit before about the fragility of like perhaps competing out of anger and using anger as a driver. So how does that sort of fit in here with what you're doing with the guys?
So Christian and Gustav is of course very different in this aspect, but both are very robust, and we have a very open environment. So I think that when in terms of both psychology and physiology, I think that there are so many coaches that have produced gold medals in the Olympics, World Championships, and so on, that doesn't have any physiological degree. And I think that psychology in a performance setting is about being human. Of course, you can come to the point where you really need somebody that are professional in the domain to help you. But in most cases, I think that it is about being a companion. So basically, when you are a coach, for me, the way I like to do coaching is that it's much more about humans, what really motivates us. And that is different from person to person. So for Christian, that is different from Gustav. And I think that in most senses it's about being able to actually ask the difficult questions. Sit down, have like a difficult talk, like you would do in a relationship. Like every time you have like a problem in a relationship, you don't run off to a psychologist to get some help. That is something you do when there is like, you're not able to do something with it anymore. That's the time when you seek like professional help in that domain. But I think that again, a normal performance setting, there are limited number to how many people you can have involved before it just becomes too much, too many, let's say, opinions, too many people dragging for your time and so on, or fighting for your time. And that's why I think that you have to limit it to some few people. And that doesn't mean necessarily that what you say always in that group is always the best or the smartest and these kind of things. But when you are spending time together, you really learn, you understand the intention of what is being said. And sometimes, of course, you say things that, I should have said that differently or something like this. But the people, when you are working together over time, you do understand exactly what is the intention, what is it trying to do. And I have a lot of focus on the intention. What is it that we are really trying to do here? What are we trying to communicate? What is important for us? And don't be afraid of critics. Because again, if the intention is that we are going to work together for a long time, or we really want to win this gold medal, or be the best in the world, or we want to learn something new, you are in it together. And then you can have differences in how you approach that. But by sitting down and actually saying, okay, I feel this way, and I think this is the right way to do it, and the other one says something different, well, that doesn't mean that you can't work together. It's more like looking, okay, do we do it in this order first, or are we getting closer to something actually that we even get a better understanding of it? Without getting too detailed, or let's say trying to exemplify too much, I think purely when it is, I think being a coach for me is about seeing the humans that we work with, understanding what are we trying to achieve together, then break it down in a way that it's tangible. So this is the performance model. And then you are looking at, okay, where are we and where do we need to go? Where do we have to be? So that's the reverse engineering part. You're making that gap analysis. And then basically you start to have to plan it out. And that's where your budget comes in. Basically, how many hours do you got available to this? Or how many calories do you have available for this? How many kilometers? Or how many kilojoules of work can you do?
Yeah. And I think one data point or one feedback point, right? You're all known for, or the system is known for data and data points and all that. And one huge aspect here is the psychology and the emotional health. And that's why you spend so much time in person, is that you can have those conversations and you can have the difficult conversations around, are we on the right trajectory? Are you executing? What do I need to do differently? And you have that really open relationship where you can give feedback and receive feedback, and everyone understands this is with a view to going faster.
Yeah.
Everything I'm saying is through the lens of, I want you to go faster. This is with your best intentions at heart and human first, right? And I think it's easy to mischaracterize the Norwegian model as lactate first, and it just isn't, right? It's person first, system, are we going to go faster?
Exactly. It takes also time. Patience is important. And also it comes down to chemistry as well. I think, and it takes time even to develop chemistry. So there can, of course, sometimes you can like just find a perfect match. Other times it takes a little bit of time. But again, yeah. I don't want it to come forward as like it sounds like we are sitting down and having like these very deep conversations every day, because we don't. I think one thing that's important there is many days where basically we don't communicate that much together. We are more like doing the training together, maybe, or not. And I sit and do my stuff, they do their stuff. But the important part is exactly that we are not afraid of communicating together.
Yeah, I think, but you mentioned that you don't have these deep and meaningful conversations, or you may not even speak that much through a day, but you're around each other. I think that's the same in a relationship, right? When you start a relationship, there's a lot of communication, there's a lot of relationship building, there's a lot of compatibility, all those things. And after a while, you don't need to say as much. You can tell by just looking, or you can hear by the way someone says something. And that's the level you need to get to, I think, with athletes, if you really want to succeed with them, is understanding them on a deeper level, such that you don't necessarily have to speak, but you can communicate. Or you don't even need to do that. You're like, hey, if something comes up, they'll let me know, and we have an open line of communication, and thus we can get there. And again, to help them go faster, right? It's always in context of what are we trying to achieve here as a group, right? So there was lots of conversation around, what if Christian wins or what if Gustav wins? It's like, it doesn't matter. We're all here to get better. And that's the context here. And they can have those conversations with you, and they can have tough conversations with each other as well, right? And you've created that environment, and that's so key. And there's been conversations about other people coming in, other athletes or something like this. And you're very selective, and that's why, right? Because cultural fit's really important, and they're not Norwegian. Culture is more than just a country. It is the situation you've created for yourself.
Yeah, exactly. I think I really the guys really like to train with others, and I have no problems with that. But it's also a little bit that I would say that having responsibility for athletes is something that I take very serious, or having responsibility for any human. And by that I mean that there are only so many people that I can really devote my time to the level that I expect from myself. And I would expect also, if I were an athlete and somebody, or I knew that what I could deliver to myself. And I have been extremely fortunate, and I think this is something that for myself, it's very important to remind myself about also, because it's easy to forget in a busy day. Actually, that just sitting here and having this conversation with you as well is something that is actually quite unique. I am incredibly fortunate, and that is actually something that I like you mentioned. Okay, there are many people around me that we could have spoken much more about, and I actually hope that we actually will spend a little bit more talking about, because it is very important for me to try to fit in more time to give back as well. But also on the coaching aspect, I don't say there's only one way to do this. There are many ways to do it, but this is the way that we have done it, just in our culture. I think some of the things we do are universal. Some of the things we do are specific to our group. So, for example, the way that we keep our conversations, the way that we do, let's say call it more the day-to-day coaching, for example, that is specific to our culture. The things that I think are more universal is, for example, the performance model. You can't escape the first law of thermodynamics, for example. Sometimes if I don't understand something, okay, so how can I get an understanding of it, which have now been condensed down to the performance model that we have. It's not unique in a sense that the people haven't made performance models before. There are plenty of them. And as a tool then to know where to prioritize our time better moving forward, and how to learn and optimize for an athlete. And for myself, of course, I can say that the performance model, the way I apply it to myself is, of course, what do I produce in the other end? Because people are expecting something from me. They're expecting either a program, or they're expecting a conversation, or they're expecting
a podcast,
or they expect time together.
Yeah.
And the input to that for me also is calories.
Yeah, and energy, right? Well, I mean, no energy without calories, as you say.
Yeah.
But I think that's a really good note to end it on. I think, firstly, thank you for your time, because it's the non-renewable resource, and you are contributing going forward to next generations or knowledge generation. So thank you on behalf of the listeners. And other than that, this is part one or the initial episode of a series. So look for the rest of the series. This will be the fundamentals that the rest will sit on. So if you don't understand something in a later podcast, we've probably talked about it here. And that was the whole goal of this episode, is to try and really contextualize things. So when you hear things in the future in the podcast, you will understand them a bit more.
There is a either performance model.
Yep.
Something to reverse engineer.
Yep.
Or there is a budget.
Exactly. Alrighty, we'll leave it there. Thanks so much, Olav, and we'll be back with the next episode soon. And there you have it, episode 1 of the Norwegian Method podcast in the bag. Now, we understand some of these concepts might be a little bit tough to understand, so if you do have any questions or unrelated questions, please send them through to us via DM at the Centara Tech Instagram page, via email to info@centaragroup.com, or if you're listening on Spotify, put them in the Q&A section down there at the bottom of the podcast feed. On that note, please subscribe to the podcast if you haven't already, rate us, or indeed share us with a friend to help them improve their triathlon or other endurance sport training. So join us next week, where we'll be covering all things planning.